spinning 1,000 plates and things being pretty low key. Like, where's March for you?
You know what? March is pretty good. We're just starting to get our guys coming into the American League. So that's
Oh, of
a
course,
big
yeah.
part for us is all the CHL, some of the European kids will start coming in and funneling into Coachella Valley. So for us, it's great because we finally get a chance to work with these guys every day, and the kids get to see the pro level. So uh, that part is amazing for us to get access to these guys while our team is still playing in the American League.
What does that conversation look like with Derek Laxdal in terms of, you've got a group of players that have been, you know, chugging along all year, and then all of a sudden you're bringing in some young players who obviously, I would assume you want to give them some sort of experience that's going to benefit them long term.
Yeah, first of all, Lax has been amazing to work with.
He's a
He's
good
got
dude.
an open door policy, and he's been great with the kids, and that's from the young guys coming in and right to our veteran players. So the biggest thing with him is with each of these kids, there's a different timeline on, say, a Berkeley Catton compared to an Ole Josephson who will come in and be our first guy in out of Red Deer. So different timeline, different expectation of what's going to go on in Coachella, but we've built our American League team to be able to develop these young players. So when our kids get in there, 18, 19, 20 before they're actually coming, it's great just to get them in the building, just to see what we do, how we train them, how we skate them. But Lax has given us a lot of access, and it's much appreciated from my staff and I.
I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of an 18 or 19-year-old that's just weathered a winter in Western Canada, and then you get the call from Jeff Tambellini that you're heading to Palm Springs for a couple of weeks to put a bow on the season. That can't be the worst thing in the world.
No, it's a different American League than I was a part of, I'll tell you.
No kidding.
So I think it's pretty good. I think our veteran players have realized that it's worth investing in the team because playing somewhere else is probably not as good as it is in Palm Springs. So it's an amazing spot. It's just not a taxing environment, and that's supposed. The main thing you see right away is that by the end of the season, no one's in a rush to get out. Like, they love the city, they love the fans, the building's amazing, the investment, just the training facility, the food. Uh, just our guys are able to eat breakfast there every day, pregame meal, dinner after game. So full service wise, it's an amazing environment.
I was having a conversation the other day that I thought maybe kind of set the table for the one we're about to have. So we work with this one of our advisors at the coach's site. Used to be a product manager at Amazon, and so we probably like you, but instead of hockey players, we've got our platform, our tech, and we've got approximately a 2-year runway that we're looking at, and Dwayne makes this comment to us a couple days ago. He said, "Hey," he goes, "instead of trying to work on 10 different things at once and getting a little bit better, let's focus on breaking it into chunks where you start and finish sort of a big rock, and then move on to the next thing." And at different times, you could argue that there's maybe merit to both approaches, but let's use the example of these young kids going down to Coachella Valley, which could be, I'm assuming, a couple weeks, potentially a couple of months. Out of all the things they have to work on, how do you maybe narrow their focus a little bit and say, we want you to work on a whole bunch of things? Or is it, hey, we want you to go down there and maybe focus on one or two areas of your game, and maybe some things are better served in say, the summertime?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think the biggest thing for us is, first of all, for them to see the competitiveness of a pro environment, and then
Yeah.
the strength level of pro players. And so for
Yeah.
us, that's really the first check off is, are you even strong enough to survive at this level? And so that's our kind of our first barrier of entry is that if you can't skate and work and compete at their level, it's very difficult to stay. So if they're not built the right way physically, we really lean into that. Most of them are coming there, they're not going to play. So they get a chance to work with Brendan Wickett, our head strength coach there. And he really shows them the way the whole team trains in season. And it's one of our organizational advantages is the way we train our players in Coachella Valley is unlike anything I've seen in any of the teams I've worked with, I've heard from. Our guys trained so hard in season, and you see the payoff with a Shane Wright, a Ryan Winterton. Our veteran players are in amazing shape, and it's almost it's a barrier of entry to our team because the competitiveness in the gym is outstanding. So to see us go on two Calder Cup runs back to back years and then come back with another strong year, you start looking, okay, what's going on in Coachella? But you just look at the fitness. These guys are trained so well. So for our young players to walk in there and go from a CHL environment or a Europe environment and then walk into this, I think it's really eye opening for most of them.
So I find this fascinating because I mean, let's just go back to when you were playing, and I'd be curious to know, like, when was the first time you walked into a weight room as a hockey player to start training?
Well, I was fortunate. I came from a hockey family and
Sure.
followed dad around from the time I was 7 on. So I got to watch these guys from day one in the Pacific Coliseum in the gym. At that time, Peter Twist was
Of
the fitness
course.
guru,
Yeah, that's
and
right.
so I
Good
got to
call.
watch this team training way ahead of their time. Plus, my father was a player that trained extremely hard, so I kind of grew up in that, and I was never unaware of the work that went into being an NHL player. So
Yeah.
for me, it was amazing to see it. But as you get closer, and I think it was probably, I want to say the Spokane Chiefs camp after I was drafted in the Bantam draft, and we went to they just did testing at 8 rinks for all the drafted prospects, and you start seeing the 15-year-olds, and then you start seeing the 18, 19, and 20-year-olds that you're competing against, and just the difference uh, walking in that door as a 14, 15-year-old kid after the draft. So that was pretty humbling when you're the person that's in there and you have to see what you're going up against.
Well, and I imagine since then, um, you know, we've acquired so much new information, and I don't want to call them trends, but certainly there's been certain things get popular, and I would just say, like, when you talk about how hard the players train in season, there was probably a point not too long ago where there may have been a rationale that said, hey, we don't want to train that hard in season because we're saving our body. And that happens in the off season. It's more maintenance. Um, I'd be curious organizationally, because I sense this is where teams in the National Hockey League get a competitive edge where, they accumulate information and then they make a decision says, hey, we're going to put our chips, in this bucket over here. And we believe that this is going to have a lasting impact on our franchise.
Yeah, and the one part of that is there's pushing and then there's training, but the organizational investment into the sports science aspect has been amazing. So, our head strength coaches, we have Gary Roberts as a strength conditioning performance consultant. So we have the top trainers, but that are also well versed in the recovery and the performance of the athlete to manage workload throughout the season, to not be overtaxing players at the wrong time. And so that equation of when we train guys, how hard against the practice workload and the game workload is a huge advantage that we have because we've made that investment. So it's pretty impressive walking into our sports science offices and dealing with Gary and Nate Brookerson and Jake Jensen, and these guys are so smart of when they're going to train their guys, how they're going to do it, and really managing each player individually.
Well, speaking of all this information, I'd be curious when you wake up in the morning and you reach for your phone, what's the first thing you look at?
There's on the West Coast, I try to get up early because the world is moving,
Yeah, no
and
kidding.
there's usually a text from somewhere in Europe, usually Franz Nielsen, who handles all my European players and our European players, and he's updating me on what's going on with Oscar Molgaard or Zeb Forsfjell. And then it's coming pretty quick. But we're checking the scores from last night, what's going on in the morning, and making sure we know in the morning of what's coming for the day, how many of our prospects are going to play, and just getting prepared for the day ahead.
So when you talk about, like, what's going on, like, obviously anybody listening to this can jump on Elite Prospects or any number of websites and get the statistical update. What are maybe some examples of other updates that you might get outside of, the stats and just, on ice performance?
I think when you build your team in the player development departments, you're looking to acquire really smart people in different areas of the world that can give you a full verse of what's going on with your prospect day to day. So in Europe, I have Franz Nielsen. Again, he keeps me up to the minute on what's going on with our prospects overseas. I have Corey Murphy, who's based in Ottawa. He handles all our defense and our OHL players and some of our East Coast college prospects. So these guys, they know everything that's going on in the teams. I don't give them all the teams, but they are experts of what's going on with that certain player and with that team. So it really, as a staff, allows us to be almost up to the minute of the pulse of each prospect, what they're going through. Uh, Organizationally, our analytic department's done such an amazing job of just giving us data and usable data on each player. So from a due diligence side, we really know what's going on with the player, and again, analytically, we can see what's going on just from their gameplay. So it allows us to have a lot of knowledge of what's happening throughout the year for these kids, and from my standpoint, it's extremely valuable.
Do you ever have conversations with your dad when he was, in the same role as you are today with no internet, no smartphone? Um, I can see it on one hand, he might look at you and be like, you're spoiled. And on the other hand, you might look at him and say, like, what did you even do? Like, how did you like what did your 9 to 5 look like without access to, basically, all this information at your fingertips?
And it was so different because when he was doing it, player development didn't really exist. It was player personnel, and they're tracking up on
Yeah.
all their drafted players and in charge of pro more on the pro side of scouting. But there just wasn't the investment into the actual development of the player, and that's where it's really changed. Where it's become its own department, where you're just prioritizing the drafted players, and I think it's made a difference. But in competitive advantage standpoint, once the league catches up, it's pretty balanced. So I'm sure that group is probably further ahead than most at that time. And I remember even him going into Bowling Green to watch Kevin Bieksa, and I would catch that because again I'm playing against Kev on that night, so I would get to live it when he's coming in to see guys that I'm just playing against that night. So, but at that time, Vancouver made a major investment in their prospects, and they were always aware of what was going on. So again, I got to live a lot of aspects of this.
In a competitive arena like the National Hockey League, how have you learned to be patient?
I think just living it myself, and the more years you get in it, you have to have patience on so many levels. And for me, again, going through playing careers, watching friends go through playing careers, uh, you just understand that things take time. Some guys are going to hit right away; everything's going to go perfect. Other guys, it's going to take 3 years. There's going to be a lag, and they get to the league at 26. Um, and I think just the more, the longer you're in the game and the more examples you see, you realize just how important it is to find common ground and just be patient with the process. Because some guys, it just doesn't click at 20, but at 24, they're a totally different human and a totally different player. So our department, we take a really long macro approach to these guys, and we tell them almost on day one that you're 18 years old, you've come into the Kraken, but I don't need you to play in the National Hockey League until you're 24. Like we have 6 years to get to work. Some guys are on a
Yeah.
little quicker timeline, but we really like to expand that timeline to give guys time to build their game, to build their maturity. And we found that's been really effective of not pushing them. Then you have to be an amazing NHL player at 20, because when they feel that timeline right there, uh, it can change just their their outlook on just the process of it. And we're trying to get kids hooked on the process of getting better. And when we expand that out, we talk about not just making the NHL, but we want you to be a good player in the NHL that helps the Seattle Kraken in the playoffs. So we really try to stretch that out.
I'd be curious, like, how valuable is just the simplicity of having that conversation and saying, "Hey, you've got a 6 year runway." Because I think that, so often, I mean, for anybody, case in point, if you watch the National Hockey League draft, with every pick, there's somebody on a panel that's saying, this kid's going to play, he could play 2 years, or, they're, making all these projections. And there's no question that commentary filters down to the players, the parents, the agent, etc.
For sure. And we try to talk to players just the different stages of being a prospect towards the National Hockey League. Being drafted is a major step. Making the American Hockey League at 20, 21, another step. And then guy gets established in the American Hockey League, and then they become a call-up player. And it takes a lot to be a guy that's now valued by the organization to be trusted with 5 to 10 games. And then there's a difference between that call-up player and actually an established National Hockey League player, a top 10 forward, a top 5 defenseman, a top 2 goalie. Now you're on the team every day. And then there's another step of being an impact player. And so we try to drag this process out of just because you got a couple call-ups games, there's still 3 major steps ahead to get to your final goal where you're a core player of the Seattle Kraken, you're helping us in the playoffs. So again, we try to keep them going where it's not, I've played my first NHL game, I've made it. Now I can relax.
Yeah.
Like we're always trying to push them to that next step of you have to get better. Every time you go up, the competition multiplies almost by 10, going from a call-up player, then trying to take someone's job that makes $6 million. And especially for our offensive players, the reality of trying to play a power play in the National Hockey League, you have to go take somebody's job who makes $5 million or more. And it
That's a
can be
great
daunting.
framework.
Yeah. And just talking about, the skills you need to step into that. And again, that allows us to tap into the process of working with these guys. Because what we talk a lot about is when they get to the National Hockey League, if you're not built correctly and you don't have the skills required to go compete for that top 6 spot, you'll break down over time. And there's such a survival element of just getting to the league, trying to find a way to add value, stay in the league, but you're not in an additive state where you're bringing more skill sets in. You ask a kid who's played 10 games in the league and say, what are you working on? Are you trying to add anything? And the kid's going to look at you going like, I'm just trying to survive out there. So whatever you get there with initially is really what you're going to have for the first almost year. So we really push how important the development process is in the American League, that they have to be built correctly.
It's interesting. One of the most impactful conversations. Well, it wasn't really much of a conversation. It was just listening. But when I was coaching at UBC, we played an exhibition game against the Abbotsford Heat, Calgary's farm team, and so we're getting set to play the game. Get a knock on the office door, and it's Daryl Sutter, and he walks in, and he's a one in a million. First time meeting him, but he has this conversation. And it was basically we had some kids on our roster that when they played junior were tougher players, and he just wanted to ensure. He said, "Look, we don't want any shenanigans here. We just want to play a good, clean game." But he made this comment, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it was basically he's like, "Look, he's like, when your players go into the corner for a puck, they're just trying to win a puck battle. When my players go in the corner for a puck, they're trying to pay their mortgage and put food on their family's table. He goes, it's a totally different game." And I just had never heard that before, but when it was framed that way, it really sunk in. Just the I guess the level of desperation and just intensity that we see on display in the National Hockey League. How do you? It's one thing to go with that in mind, I guess. It's one thing to go and have a great shift. It's one thing to have a good game. What have you learned about building consistency on a nightly basis into your player's game?
I think the honesty from our staff towards the player of what they're walking into
Yeah.
is crucial for. Again, we go through our development process, and we do a heavy research phase of the player, try to build a really strong base relationship, and then when we get to a midseason point, we really start with a really honest conversation with the player of what they're actually trying to accomplish at the pro level and the obstacles ahead. And again, with that timeline we talked about before, we try to be very honest of what they're walking into. You're walking into the National Hockey League where you've never seen skill like this, you've never seen size and speed like this, and you've never seen desperation on a nightly basis like this. And if you're not built correctly, skill wise, fitness wise, mindset wise, you will get eaten up. It is the most ruthless hockey league in the world, and it will test you on every element. So we really push that early on so that again that we have time to build these kids correctly, but there is nothing like it. And just the schedule alone is the thing that gets most young players. CHL, NCAA, American League schedule, they're a little bit more weekend based, where the National Hockey League, it's Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday in some form of a 3-game week, and there is no time to reset. You have a good 3 games, it's great because you're playing the next night or the night after. You have a bad 3-game stretch, you're going the next night, and you have to get through something on the fly. So it is just such a relentless schedule that comes at guys, and even for us on the West Coast, the travel demands are amazing. Like just trying to get prepared without practice. So there's not a lot of times to go and work on it for 2 or 3 practice days and get over a hump. These guys, they have to be able to assess what's going on and make changes almost on the plane.
Hey, every time I come back from a flight from Toronto and I'm kind of groggy out of bed, I just think like I can't imagine how these players do this over the course of 6 months plus playoffs. I think it's probably the most under from a certainly from a fan's perspective, the most underappreciated aspect of just how unique the NHL is compared to you know the other major league sports and maybe the cadence of their schedule. Um, you know you're dealing with players that just the nature of hockey, starting at the youth levels, where and I'm just so curious because you talk about this honesty and setting the table for how hard it's going to be and the adversity. You're dealing with players that not all, but I would assume a lot, literally from the age when they first started putting on skates, they've been told how good they are. They've been recruited to play on teams. Like, I mean, we're dealing with players now that have have never had to try out because they were
Right.
just offered spots. They get to junior. They didn't really have to try out there because they were guaranteed a spot because they were deciding between, perhaps the NCAA or major junior. And then all of a sudden, they've got to go be a fourth liner in Coachella Valley, or they get sent down to the East Coast League. um, how do you, in I guess, a healthy way, sort of help these players? I'm sure they all believe they're mentally tough when they have that first conversation with you, but maybe how do you help them achieve a different level of mental toughness, or maybe even just agency over, this
Yeah.
next phase of their career?
No, it's a great question because we like to be honest with our players and we like to map out a plan. But the biggest part for us is providing solutions for these players of how they're going to get there. And if we just left them at, hey, this is going to be really hard, you've never seen this, and didn't provide them now a plan of how we're going to do this, and that's a big part for us is giving these players solutions and getting them hooked on getting better. And again, we try to start that early because, and we talk about the transition from, you know, outside of pro hockey into the American Hockey League. We talk about translatable games and building yourself a translatable game because all those rookies are going to come in and they're going to get a 5 game window where they're going to have to figure out if they're going to be a power play guy, if they can play on a third line or a second line, and there might only be given 12 minutes. So all those things in their game are going to get magnified. Where if that translatable game of, we call it like a 7-8 minute game, if you can't survive in that game with great wall play, puck management, be able to protect it, understanding pressure levels. If you can't just do those basic things at the pro level, you can't work your way up the lineup. And so we really push guys of breaking their game past, goals and assists to, 6 areas for forwards and 6 areas for D that are crucial when translating from non-pro to the American Hockey League. And we talk about this is going to be the same thing you're going to deal with in the National Hockey League because a kid gets called up, he's going to be given about 12 minutes and he's going to have to do something special in those 12, but also play well enough to stay on the ice. We
Yeah.
just had Yanni Newman who scored 2 power play goals for us last week in Seattle. And we've been all over him for the last 2 years about your wall play has to be good. You have to be a good, trusted wall player. Franz Nielsen did an amazing job with him over in Europe because he knew how important it was going to be to play for Dan Bilesma and be reliable along the wall, just so you can go back on the ice for the next shift. And so all those things, and we try to be really honest with guys of how important these things are at the next level. They might not feel that way in the CHL or in college hockey because you get 23 minutes and that those 2 rims aren't important, but you miss those 2 rims in the National Hockey League in your first game, you're probably not going back on the ice.
Yeah.
So for each position, and different for centers, different for defensemen, but uh, we talk about ability to win minutes, and that can be through 5-on-5 play. When a kid comes up, does he have a special teams role? Does he actually have a special teams role? Whether it's a power play role, is he a real penalty killer? Because for us, that those are minutes, and you're trying to get from 8 minutes to 10 to 12 to 14 and work your way up the lineup. So that translatable element is crucial. And so giving guys solutions and putting importance on that part of the game is something we do because it defines their pro career.
Well, I'm so interested, and you don't need to get into the 6 areas that you might keep track of, say for forwards or defensemen. I'm sure that's proprietary, but one of the uniquenesses of hockey is that you've got prospects that are playing over in Sweden in the SHL as 18-year-olds against men, and might not be on the power play, but then you've got your first rounders in Spokane playing against 16 and 17-year-olds, and he's having a
Yeah.
great year, but he's
Yeah.
playing against 16 and 17-year-olds, and then you've got kids that are 18 and they're freshmen in college, and they might be at a program where there's 10 other draft picks on the roster and they're fighting for ice. What are maybe some of the baseline things that help you keep a pulse on what success looks like, or perhaps if a player is addicted to getting better and making improvements, when the obvious stats probably don't tell a really clear story?
Yeah, and for us, it's different. The way we handle the CHL players compared to an SHL player, a Liga player, is very different. CHL players, especially by the time they're drafted at 18 and 19, they're in a performance phase. They're in a spot where they're going to show us how talented they are. They're going to show us if they can put up a big number. Jagger Firkus last year wins CHL Player of the Year, and he shows us he can score over 120 points. He shows us he can be an elite power play guy. Is he getting tested as a fourth, third line guy trying to work his way into pro minutes? No, but he can't control the league he plays in. Where Yanni Niemann, who is on the other side of the planet playing in Liga, he's trying to earn a pro role. So he's an 18 and 19-year-old trying to get on the power play, trying to get middle 6 minutes. So for him, it's different because he's already playing that pro role. So we know that he's dealing with the same experience that he's going to have when he comes to Coachella. Now he doesn't have a chance to show us how high he can go production wise because he's in a different situation, but that's okay. So we try to take each player, look at the situation they're in, and really emphasize, okay, this is what you're in, this is how you're going to use this at the next level, and gives them some context to it. We talk to our CHL kids that are producing at that mass amount of, you're in this phase where you are a high production player, you're not getting the reps of important depth minutes that are going to help you one day become an AHL player, an NHL player, but you're also showing us that you can be an elite producer or an elite two-way player. So just making them aware of what they're getting in that league and not getting, and just having that conversation early with them, just so it's part of our narrative throughout the year.
We get this interesting lens through the coaches site, whereas you mentioned wall play. So when we talk to coaches, let's say if you're doing presentations, at our events, 10 years ago, nobody talked about wall play. Well, guess what? Like everybody wants to come and talk about wall play now because it's so important. And a while back, it was like everybody's like, oh, I want to talk about punch turns and an outside edge. Like that became kind of the thing. When you look at that jump from, say, junior to the American League and the American League to the NHL, what might be some of the required skill sets, or maybe the underappreciated skill sets, that no matter how many points you put up in junior, no matter how well you handle the puck, that if you can't do these things, you're just not going to be able to play and contribute as you make those steps up the ladder?
Yeah, it's a great question, and for us, it's processing speed and the ability to execute under high pressure.
How do you
Those
measure
are,
that?
I think you have to. You're looking at what's going on during the game, and
Yeah,
you're looking at the plays that are truly under high pressure, and you're evaluating players on those plays.
yeah.
And again, we're building and we're training them under high pressure. I have Justin Ryan on my staff, and I believe he's one of the best young skill coaches in the world. And his whole concepts are based around pressure levels and being able to read the play and understanding the pressure level you're under. And we've spent a ton of time with guys of, again, building that in their game and forcing them into drills where they are under high pressure and have to execute and process the play at a high level. Because really, you give a guy a 2-on-1 and you give them a ton of time, they're going to make the play. but you jam a guy at the blue line and he has to make a high pressure play under a triangle on that same 2-on-1, and it looks different.
Yeah.
And so we really talk about just the speed and the pressure level you're going to be under at the American Hockey League level and then at the National Hockey League level, and building that into their game.
Shout out to Justin Rye. Had him in Richmond in
Yep.
the junior B loop. It's been a great to see him, where he's ended up and the path he's carved out for himself. I've heard you talk a lot in prior interviews about players building trust. I think there's such an emphasis now, especially in our world with coaches, where it's sort of on them to build the relationship with players, for them to build trust with the players. But I find it interesting that it would appear that you put a real onus on the players to say your play, how you show up, how you work, etc. Like that's an equal part of that relationship. It's not just a one way. It's got to be both parties, um, you know, building trust and again in a really high stakes environment.
And I think that it's part of the conversation that you have to have with your players. And I was fortunate to get to coach right out of my playing career. And when you can speak to the player of talking about trust and going, well, I need you to do this because if I can't trust you, how am I supposed to put you on the ice? And
Yeah.
that conversation from coach to player, I think, is so important. And I'll use Kent Johnson was one of my players in trail, and he was a
Oh,
young, elite, skilled player. He was so talented, and he was a kid that wanted to play in the last minute. And so we talked about how important just his defensive shifts of whether it's blocking a shot or getting in a lane and deterring a scoring chance. If he doesn't do that enough time during a game, how am I supposed to put you out in the last minute when the lead's in the line? I know that you want that empty netter and I want you to go finish that, but you have to prove to me throughout the night that you can do it. And to his credit, he was a smart player and he figured out how important certain plays were in the game. And then again, trust was built. He goes out there and on the majority of nights, he took care of business. And within 20 seconds, the puck's in the empty net and he's on his way to a 100-point season and we win the game.
oh man, I was literally just texting with his dad yesterday, and I'd be curious. We talk about these building blocks with players, but you mentioned that you had a coaching background. Um, when you look at your own career arc and building blocks, how important is it that you have that opportunity to reflect back on being a coach yourself?
Oh, it was an amazing experience. First, to get to go to Michigan right out of playing and work with
Yeah,
their staff, Mel Pearson, Bill McCult, Brian Wiseman. I mean, these guys were amazing coaches, and to come right from playing and walk into that staff, they were at the beginning of building just a powerhouse in college hockey. And watching them coach and recruit and just handle these top players, it was so impressive. And then got the opportunity to go to Trail as GM and head coach as a young person in the next side of the business, and it was an amazing experience just to get thrown into building a team and building a team from a manager sense, but also developing young players. And I for me, it was just an amazing 2 years of working with guys and trying to get them to a top level early on. But as I've got to today, understanding what it feels like to be the head coach and make the decisions on players. It's so valuable for knowing what's going on the bench each night. I'm going to watch our prospects, even watching our team in Seattle and Coachella, understanding the pressure of what the head guy deals with each night has given me so much context when I go down after a game and speak with them of how difficult that job is and actually that they're managing 26 people per night. The
yeah,
20 that are in the game and the 6 that aren't, and
yeah.
how
Great call.
how difficult that job is.
When you first got to Michigan in a coaching capacity, was there anything that I don't want to say caught you off guard, but that just maybe you hadn't anticipated was a part of that role?
Well, one thing I've seen, again, I grew up in the business, but I think anytime you walk into a new profession or something you want to pursue and you see it done at a top level, you're so humbled by how good the top guys are at that level. So to walk into college hockey and see one of the best staffs and how they recruit and how they coach and their knowledge of this wave of players, but also their knowledge of the last four waves of players and how they can speak to that experience. It's so humbling to see how experienced these guys are. And no different when you walk in with one of the top general managers in the league and you listen to them talk about the entire world of players and how many guys are out there. And they talk about, this is 15, 20 years worth of views and knowledge of these players. And it's as a young player transitioning into coaching, or anybody coming into the business, when you get to see the top guys work, it is so impressive. How hard they work just on a daily basis, but their knowledge has been built over just a mass amount of years.
I guess there's probably a lot of comparables that you know in the industry that you're in, whether you're a player or in management, reps count for a lot. Like you can't
Yep.
replace that. You can't read a book and get reps. Like you need to go out and, you need to sit in the rink, watch players, different levels, and that just takes time and experience.
It really does. And you talked about, how important patience is.
Yeah.
If you've watched enough players and the development curves on different guys, and why some guys hit and why some guys don't, if you've built up enough games and views and waves of players, you'll see why it's so important. And you'll see the guys that hit late, and you're going, geez, I watched this 6 years ago with this guy, and they just gave him a little bit
Totally.
more time, and how important that is. And again, you look at the best coaches, the best managers, they've seen this for so long, and they have such context of what's going on with the player today. Uh, it allows them to be the best in the world.
I want to go back to trail. So I remember when you came to trail, and obviously for anybody that's not aware, I mean, that's the Tambellini name and trail. I mean, I coached with the smoke heaters. Like it's a big deal. Your dad's from there. And so when you came back to coach, I think there was this maybe feeling that, hey, like this might have been the job you had for the rest of your life. Um, and then all of a sudden you went to Tampa Bay as a scout. I'm curious, just from a from a perspective of managing your own career, when you retired, like was coaching the direction you thought you were going to go? Was there a point where you said, hey, like maybe I want to go into management? How did you look at, or how did you make that decision to go to Tampa as a scout?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Like when I retired, I knew I wanted to build teams and be a part of
Yeah.
teams. You never know where that experience is going to come. And so when
Yeah.
I got the call to go to Michigan, two parts. First, to go back and finish my degree. That was something that was on my list,
What
and
was
you
your
never
degree
really
in?
know sports management and communication.
No, no
So
way.
I had 3 years finished, and you never really know how you're going to go back and do this. So first, it gave me the opportunity to go back and finish the degree, uh, and I was preparing to do my MBA at University of Denver, and
No
out of
kidding.
nowhere, trail comes up.
Yeah,
They made a change, and trail comes up, and sometimes you never know what's going to come up in the hockey world. And I
totally.
didn't think Michigan was going to come up, and it was one phone call away, and now I'm at Michigan. And with trail, same thing. Went from thinking I'm going to go do my MBA to now I get a chance to do two jobs in trail, and hopefully build a franchise at the junior
Yeah.
level. So uh, it was an amazing experience. But one of the things as I was prepping to do do my MBA is you looked at just the way they build their courses. You're knowledgeable in accounting and finance and econ and so many different ways. And the way I looked at my career, and I watched my father do this, is he did so many different jobs in the business. He started as public relations, went to player personnel, got into the business side of the Vancouver Canucks, then came back to as an AGM, then to a GM. But by the time he was a GM in Edmonton, he had such an understanding of the full business. And I saw how valuable that was for him. So for me, I was fortunate to have these opportunities come up. But when I was in trail, I got a chance to meet with Julian Brisebois and his staff, who I'd played for late in my playing career
Oh, in Syracuse, yeah.
in Syracuse. So to have the opportunity to add the scouting background, something that I didn't have through the first 3 years of coaching, to me that was it was going to be so valuable because if you want to build teams, player evaluation is the core of that. You have to be able to evaluate talent, make good decisions, build lists, and get it right on a personnel stance. And that's something that I didn't have in the first 3 years. And when I look at the staff they had in Tampa Bay with Julian and Matthew Darsh and Stacy Roost, who does an amazing job on the player development side,
Yeah.
Jamie Pusher, who is probably one of the top pro scouts in the game right now, just a chance to learn from that group of managers was I couldn't say no to that. And they were in a window where they were making decisions to win the Stanley Cup. And as a young person trying to learn from the top players, in the management game and the coaching game, to get that opportunity, it was just something I couldn't pass up.
I look at it, when you're a player, your orbit's pretty closed. You're just trying to get to the bus on time. You're trying to get to the game, trying to eat your next meal, your nap, etc. And then you get into coaching, and it's not too dissimilar, in that your orbit's pretty close. But then you go into a scouting role, and I would anticipate that all of a sudden, you're watching, games at a variety of levels. You're seeing
Yeah.
practices at a variety of levels, and I'm sure that the one thing that would occur to you is that there's not one way to do this. There's a lot of different ways to develop players. There's a lot of different ways to build a team. There's a lot of different ways to communicate with people. How important is that, just to sort of see the game from a 30,000 foot view and have the opportunity? I'm sure in the when you're waiting at the airport terminal or driving in the car to Moose Jaw, to sort of digest all that and process it and maybe evaluate what's going to fit best for you.
Yeah, and I was fortunate. Like the job I did in Tampa, it was a college scouting and pro scouting role. So it was American League, National Hockey League, and NCAA. So it gave me a chance to really scout leagues that I knew well, and players that I'd seen before. But it's so valuable to watch the game through a different lens. You get used to watching it in a coaching way the first 3 years while you're watching systems and you're watching forechecks and neutral zones and the adjustments teams are making in game. And then you go to a scouting role and you're just watching the players. And it's such a different way to watch a game where you're not as concerned with, whether it's a 1-1-3 or a 2-1-2. You're watching, an individual player and evaluating if that player can play for your club one day. And I thought it was just such a different way to evaluate the player and just to watch the game in general. And just that opposite view almost was amazing to go through, and just coming off coaching. So it took a minute just to transition from
Yeah, I
watching
bet.
the systems of the game to really the ability of the player and what he could potentially bring to us. But something I'm happy I have now.
When you're evaluating players, whether it's say in a pro scouting role, in your current role, I guess speaking of roles, I mean, you're going to go watch a player, and they're going to play a role that arguably that coach, the organization they're with, has said we think this player fits into this box. But in a lot of cases, that may not be the box that they're going to fit into in the National Hockey League. How do you sort of remove the biases, I guess, and say we got to maybe look past that and sort of identify those skill sets that we think are going to translate best to the NHL?
Yeah, I think from when we're watching our prospects, whether it's in a CHL game or a college game, we're trying to find that elite trait to really leverage.
Yeah,
And early on, especially when we just take in our newest group of prospects, we really don't rush in to get that development plan in place because we have a huge research phase that we go through. We really need to understand
no
the
way.
player. We need to understand the player from the previous year. Our amateur staff does an amazing job of just live views, due diligence, of really getting an understanding of the player. And then as we come in, we'd like to watch this player for the first part of the season. How are they adjusting to being a drafted player? Does that change anything in the player? And really getting a sense of now we're building up closer to a 2-year window of the prospect, and not rushing in day one where we don't have as good a context on the player. And we're looking for their ability to transition from a draft eligible player now to an older player in the league for a CHL guy, and to find that elite trait. What are we going to leverage in this kid? What is the real gap? Is that actually a gap, or and we're going through a whole checklist of things of what are we going to build this player into?
I wanted to ask you, and this had never occurred to me until doing some research for this, but your dad played in Europe in the later stages of his career. Did you play hockey in Europe as a kid?
I started skating over there. That was my
No way.
my first entry. I think it was 3 or 4 years old. So that was kind of how I picked it up. And I think it was the second year we were in Austria, and the way their team did practices, they would go on at want to say noon or 1 o'clock, and they would pretty much only take half the ice. They probably had half their team, whether it's for pregame skate or just a light practice. So I would just take the other end and just start skating by myself. So that was
Come on.
my entry, yeah, in VLOC. So I just kind of learned on half a sheet to myself, and then Dad would come in when they were finished and pass me a couple pucks. But uh, that was the entry.
No kidding. When you look back at your own, path as a younger player and just, having that exposure in Europe and I obviously your dad probably having that exposure to how players were developed in Europe. And I sense that the gap between how things were done in North America and how they were done in Europe at that time was probably far greater than it is today. Is there anything that you can point to say, hey, like, this part of my game, or, you know, if I don't have that experience or my dad doesn't go over there to play, I maybe don't acquire that sort of that tool.
I think, especially in the job I do today, just understanding what it feels like to go the other way and to be the
Yeah.
import guy going to a different country and know what the Swedish players and the Finnish players and Czechs and Russians feel like coming to North America, and just the ability to find common ground with guys and the issues that are bigger than they assume when players come over. It's the language, it's the food, it's just all the things that aren't home. So,
Yeah.
when we handle our prospects, and again, Yanni Newman is a player that's just scored his first two NHL goals for us in Seattle the other night, and he was a player that learning English for the first time. And so you're building this big development plan, and sometimes you think it's all hockey, and how's this game going to translate? But really, it was the relationship, and it was his ability just to learn the language and then transition to North America. And so, just knowing what that feels like by living in those countries, the adjustments that I made, anybody that's coming from Canada or the United States makes going to Europe. Again, just finding some common ground, and again, just having uh, some patience with guys who are just trying to figure out how to do it over here. So uh, that's been a really important part, something that I think has helped me a lot. And then also seeing just that there's a different way to play the game as well. I mean, you watch the teams in Sweden, how
Yeah.
smart they are tactically, how hard these guys train. I was just so impressed in Sweden of just their detailed training, how smart the coaching was of just using the width of the ice and just a really different approach to playing the game. So I think anytime you expose yourself to just the world of hockey and different ways of doing things, it's so valuable. And I took just a lot of things from my time in Europe as a kid, but especially going back.
Was it a that's so interesting. So when you went over there as a pro, did it, even at that stage of your career, it caught you off guard a little bit, or not? Maybe that's the wrong term, but just how different it was, and maybe especially coming from the National Hockey League.
I think you're excited just to learn different ways of doing it.
Yeah,
And for me, like I always knew I wanted to get into the building teams and the next part. So you're always looking to just learn and take things from other coaches and other staffs, and getting to play with some really impressive organizations. Like just I got to play for Sam Hallam, who just ran Team Sweden in the Four Nations tournament, and here's a young coach who's in his early 30s, and he's handling a big group of imports, and the way he had us play and the structure and just the possession game that we played. I was just so impressed just with his style, and it allowed us to win that year. Henrik Evertson had built a great team, and then Sam came in and put an amazing structure in, and it's just a really different way of doing it. Different than the NHL way, but so you take a great experience like that, and now you're open to these new concepts because you've seen it, they have success, and then you kind of get hooked on learning, again, different strategies around the world and how impactful they can be.
I just sense, Jeff, from this conversation that you're somebody that is very curious, and that as while you may not have been overly intentional about saying, hey, I've got to keep my eyes and ears open because one day I'm going to get into management, but you know maybe just intuitively you would have been collecting information. Are there any other people or experiences that when you reflect on, you say, gosh, like that was really valuable in terms of setting me up for where I am today?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like I've been very fortunate to play for great clubs
Yeah.
and to learn and be put in chances to have success in whatever league that is. And you just start seeing these constants that run through all these top teams. Just the work rate, the creativity, the investment in the players, and what their families go through each year. And it just the top teams, they're always pushing the limits of, how can we do it better? Uh, can we find a new strategy that gives us an edge for a short amount of time? I saw this in Vancouver at the time in 2010, 11. They were so far ahead of just the analytics of the game, zone starts. We'd start the Sedins almost on every ozone start. Kessler Malhotra would go out depending on the dot. We had Dr. Z, who is revolution the performance side after the game just on sleep training. And so you start seeing what these top clubs are doing. And for me now, we're trying to zoom out past hockey and go into what are they doing in basketball? What are they doing in the NFL? What are they doing in the Premier League? And what are teams doing that are consistently winning championships? And for me, it's zooming past teams that win each year and looking at the clubs that they're winning multiple championships and they're competing for a decade. And those are the teams that are really doing it well, that repeated success where they can change the roster over time, but they still have the ability to push the limits strategically and performance wise and create an environment where people want to come. And so you start just seeing these top clubs around the world that have been able to do that. And again, just going through it, and I've been fortunate to play on some of them and just see what that looks like internally. For me, you just get hooked on that.
A couple weeks ago, I was really fortunate. I had a chance to go down. I was down in Minnesota for the high school state championships, but had a chance to get a tour of the Minnesota Vikings facility and meet with their staff. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, why are you guys so geeked up over hockey? Like they just had so many questions and fascinated. But have you been on the other side of that table where you've had a chance to go and chat with folks in other sports? And if so, any key takeaways from those experiences?
Yeah, I think there's lots of takeaways. Fortunate, even just you know researching and reading about different clubs, and you look back at some of the champions of different sports of whether it's the way the Chicago Cubs built their teams under Theo or
Yeah,
the way the Houston Astros, how hard they push player development,
yeah.
almost to the point of excess. But at the core of it, they're developing batters and pitchers in Houston and just the extremes that people are going to. So what we've tried to create, and that's again where we've been beneficial, is that in Seattle we got to build player development from scratch, and you're trying to create this environment where you're looking to develop players at each level of the process, as prospects, as American League players, as National Hockey League players, and over invest in these guys where they are hooked on getting better, and you're giving them access to that through each step.
I love that you brought up just the Astros and the Cubs. I'm curious. Have you read either the Cardinal Way or Astro Ball?
Astroball, yes,
Yeah, so
and
good.
Cubs way, yes,
Yeah, yeah, it's
yeah,
Cub Ways too. Yeah, I would highly recommend. There's another earlier. It's the Cardinal Way, and it's interesting because it's Jeff Luhnow when he started with the Cardinals, and it sort of predates
okay.
Astro Ball and how that all the origins and of all that, and some of the drafts they had in St. Louis, and kind of flipped the script. Um, if you had a magic wand and you could be a fly on the wall of any organization outside of hockey and professional sports, is there any that you'd want to drop into?
Oh, I think there's a lot of spots you wanna drop into. I mean, you look at the Golden State Warriors, what they did in their prime, what they were able to do, uh, what Manchester City was able to do when they're, coming onto the scene, a handful of years back where they're really just pushing the limits and Pep's team is taking them to a different stratosphere. I was fortunate I got to see it in Tampa Bay with, 3 years in a row plus a decade's worth of competition of what that looked like and the evolution of that club by keeping almost a very similar staff the whole way. It was Steve Eiserman, Julian, and John Cooper and his staff, and got to see just the inner workings of that, of having a chance to win the cup almost 10 years straight. So I've been fortunate, but yeah, I've got about 15 teams that I would have loved to be a fly on the wall.
Oh my god, I'm kind of halfway through the All or Nothing series on Man City, and Pep is just like he's a bit of an alien just in how he so counterintuitive to how you imagine
Yeah,
a coach dealing with professional players. Jeff, like in a world where not only is there a lot of information, but everybody has access to that information, and I think whatever day we're at, it's easy to feel like, oh, we've hit the ceiling. But
yeah.
we know that somebody else is going to innovate. There's going to be something new and better. Is there any areas of whether it's team building or player development where you would point to and say, I sense there's still a lot of room to grow in this area? And the first thing that comes to mind is, I mean, just I'm curious, like, AI is going to affect your job. Maybe it already has, but I sense that's going to open up a whole new world.
Yeah, AI, we've seen. I'm fortunate to work for one of the best tech teams in the National Hockey League, and
No
I'd
kidding.
say
Yeah.
pro sports, and just how it's revolutionized just scouting reports of being able to take a clump of data and kick you
Yeah.
out a summary in instant speed, and how fast that goes from making each scout go through and summarize 200 reports, where this is something you can do now with the click of the button. So this is something our analytics team does on a daily basis. They kick out a new solution that speeds our world up. So there's definitely an AI push, but also, you look at the improvements of just where fitness was in the late '90s, early 2000s. Where player development's got to, and just really identifying skill sets and building players at a different rate. I always look at the mental performance of players and think there's always so much space for players to get to a different level, just performance wise, how they see the game, how they prepare, their process. I always think that's a real definer between the elite and just the good players, is that they have their process, and it's at such a specific level, and they're just so clear of what they're trying to do every day. I always just think there's a ton of space on the mental side of top performance.
How do you, I'd be curious, and partly because, just in my world, gosh, I feel like every week I get an inbound email from some new app or platform that helps athletes, manage their own mental performance, or perhaps is a way for coaches and organizations to keep a pulse on where their athletes are mentally. How have you learned to, maybe just get a pulse on whether a player is in a in a good spot, or perhaps if they might need some additional support?
Yeah, and we look at it from the context of, you're asking players to win multiple times, and you're trying to build teams that can have consistent success, but how hard that is on the players, on the staff, and you have to have them in the right mindset to push through all those things each year. And again, you need perspective of, what are you trying to accomplish each day and each season, and then be able to go back. It's always so impressive teams that can run it back and can make changes. And I always think it's based on usually the head coach of the messaging to the players of what he's selling in terms of, this is the vision, this is why we're working after, we just celebrated a month and a half before, and now we're going to push again. And I just think the top teams can convince and explain to their players, how they're going to do it and why they're pushing to win on the macro stage. And it's impressive when you see it. And I just think the best teams have really found a way to get that part right with their teams, and then individually, how are these guys going to build a process that they're going to be able to repeat this for 10 years straight and stay healthy and have perspective and challenge themselves. And yeah, that's where we're trying to go. No different than Seattle. We're trying to build a team from the beginning and build it to a spot where we're competitive for a decade.
From my perspective, the thing that I find so interesting about the Seattle Kraken organization, and I'm sure there's parts of the story that you'd only know on the inside, but you guys all obviously follow the Vegas Golden Knights, who have who had early success. It seems that they have a very distinct way of building their team, and the NHL is a bit of a copycat league. Yet the Seattle Kraken seem to have adopted a very different approach to team building, one that's very much rooted in developing your own players, playing the long game, being patient, um, and you know, or organizationally, because regardless of what market you're in, there's a lot of pressure to win. How is an organization, do you kind of put those blinders on and play that long game? Because I just again, I'm preparing for this. I mean, you start doing a little bit of googling, you're like, holy smokes, like there's an opportunity here in 3-4 years, like this roster is going to be absolutely stacked if we can just
Right.
stick with it.
And that's the hardest part is to build the foundation of a team correctly.
Yeah.
And our general manager, Ron Francis, he lived through you know, the Pittsburgh years where, that team was outstanding and they could have easily won 3 cups and more if they had stayed together. And so you see what he's done. Jason Barwell comes in with 3 Stanley Cups himself. And we have an organization that is willing to invest in the foundation of the team. And so that's draft capital, investment in player development, investment in our American League team. And I think what's been able to be sold is that you have to understand how long that takes. You know, we have a player playing in Spokane that could be one of our best players when we get a chance to really compete for the Stanley Cup. We can't make him 23 tomorrow. And how long that takes to get him, to the National Hockey League, but also built correctly. And in a cap system, if you rush it, how detrimental that can be. And so Ron's done an amazing job of selling the vision of building this foundation correctly, acquiring draft capital, acquiring top prospects, investing in the development. And then again, it takes sometimes longer than people want, but when built correctly, now you have a chance to compete over term. And that's the
Yeah.
exciting part. And that's something that Ron's really tried to push. And you listen to just at the trade deadline, what he's spoken of is we've got to a point where we've acquired a lot of assets. And now
Yep.
how he's going to use that, that's going to be up to him. But it takes time just to acquire assets when you're starting from zero. You start with, your picks, your 7 picks that year, plus your expansion team, and you don't have that depth of capital within the hockey world. So we're finally at a spot where now we're building it, and I think Ron's done a really good job of just selling how important it is to have patience in this stage. Because if you fast track it, it starts breaking at the foundation, and it can be detrimental to where we're trying to get to down the road.
Totally. Totally. Well said. Uh, yeah. As we close here, Jeff, you've mentioned, you know, part of your job is to get players addicted to getting better. I can't imagine that message lands unless the person delivering it is addicted to getting better. As you go through your day to day, what are maybe some of the things that you do to improve, and is there any resources that have been valuable to you that might be valuable to some of our listeners?
I think the first thing is, that's given me an ability to learn early on. It's just ability to listen, get around good people who have done it for a long time and listen. Something in the first 5 years, I just try to get in the room as many times with the top guys and just listen to what they're talking about. Listen to what was important to them. Listen to how they live their day. What's their process from they wake up to the end of the day, and what does that look like? And
Yeah.
again, being fortunate to be around some real top performers. But I think whatever your craft is, investing in it, investing in that layer, but also zooming out and going on more of a macro stage of getting into what you're trying to develop in hockey. What are they doing in other sports? What are in just the coaching lens or the team building sense? What are people doing outside of just our game? And I think just being open to new ideas and different strategies for me, that's been helpful. And you realize really quick that you sure don't know everything, and people have great
Yeah.
ideas, and just trying to get with people and get into those conversations where you can talk about how they got there. And again, I've been very fortunate to be around a lot, and it's something that I challenge my staff to do the same thing. Invest in the way they're learning, the way they're watching games. is there something they found that they could bring to us, and being really open to new strategies and new concepts. So, um, yeah, that's been the biggest thing. I mean, what you guys have done on the coaches site, I know that was extremely valuable, going from player to coach, and just seeing the resources that you guys had available, uh, to all coaches. I mean, I think start watching some of the videos of top NHL coaches of them going through whether it's a penalty kill or a forecheck or a practice plan, and seeing the meticulous detail of where they're lining up pucks and the timing of the drill, and then you start really getting hooked on, okay, well, like, what else is there? And it really starts taking you down a rabbit hole, and you just get hooked on just the detail that the best people are bringing every day. But again, look no further than what you guys have created. It's an amazing sight of, you can take out of that whatever you invest into it, you're going to get double out.
Well, speaking of listening to experience and smart people, you're going to be presenting at TCS Live this year. Since we last spoke, we haven't talked about what you're going to be presenting on, and I don't know if you have an exact topic, but do you have any thoughts on what you might have in store for our audience?
Well, I think the biggest thing for our department is building development plans, and how do we get to that? What's our process going into it, and how do we individualize it per player, but also build them in a systematic way where we can handle 37 players, 45 players at the same time. So, I think just being able to speak to how we get to the actual development plan,
Yeah.
when we present it, and just how we weed through all the different things that go into getting a player to that level of really getting down to the important things of how we decide of really the messaging that we're going to push on the player.
Awesome. Well, listen, man, we can't wait. We really appreciate your time. We're looking forward to seeing you in Ann Arbor, and best of luck to you and the Kraken down the stretch here.
Aaron, thank you so much for having me.